recently, I think maybe 2 days ago, with someone I'm working on who's working on a very large NBC network show right now. And he said he's frustrated. He's not in a director position, so he's frustrated sometimes when there are directors on the show that he feels are there for other reasons, being that there's a quota to have, in his words, white and black directors on the show. So he said, you know, we've had some women directors and some of them have been really, really good. He said others of them, I know you're just there to fill a quota. And so that for me was, I think, like he obviously recognized when someone is in his perspective talented, and when they're in his perspective not capable, they don't have what it takes to lead that group of people. And then it's interesting also that if that his reasoning for the women who had fallen below a certain level, in his opinion, that they were only there, he knew they were only there because they had to fill a quota. And I think it's very difficult because I'm not sure how quotas work on network TV. That was his perspective of why it was happening. Obviously, if the person had been a man and had fallen below a certain level, that wouldn't have been the reasoning behind it. They wouldn't have said you're here because we're filling a quota or something. They would have just said you're not sufficient. You're not a good enough director.
Like, to me, that seems very passive aggressive too, right? It's sort of like that's. I think that's the way power replicates itself. Because if you're not in that dynamic, right? If you're not in that demographic, then it's like, even if you get there, it's like you're being undermined because the assumption is, not from everybody, but certainly from some, that you're only here because we have to do this, not because you're good enough to be here.
And that's how it read to me. It read as invalidating, as I know you're only here because you're a woman. And he went on to say, I think you should be here based on your skill and based on what you can do. And, you know, I think that's true. I think we would all agree that people should be there based on how they run the show. But it's tricky and it's a dangerous way of thinking, because you could say that about any.
It's also perception too, right?
A marginalized group.
Yeah.
And I find that there's males view things differently than females. Not always, but sometimes. Like, for example, I programmed a film at Real World my first year called A Touch of Grey, which was about a bunch of older women who had a reunion, like 25-year reunion, and I guess all the dynamics from high school, everything came out. And so I watched the movie, and to be honest, I was like, I didn't get it. And I was like, yeah, I don't. And then I look over, and I watched it with my wife, because we watch some of these films together sometimes, and she's like crying. And I was like, what? So I programmed it, and we sold out 2 screenings. And at that time, I had the power, because I've since stepped down from that position, but I had the power to decide which Canadian films go on screen at Real World and which didn't, right? So it was also looking at myself in the mirror and going, you know what? I see things through a certain lens. Like, you need that certain amount of self-perception and go, I am now programming for other demographics.
Yeah. I think something that you actually said earlier today was something about privilege. And checking your privilege. You only notice when...
So there's this article, and it's talking about, like, white, specifically, I guess, male privilege. And how, like, I have a lot of friends who are like, well, I don't see color, I don't see gender, and the thing they point out was like, and that's your privilege. It's your privilege that you don't have to see color. You don't walk in a room and you don't notice it because you don't have to. Like that and that in itself is the ignorance of it, of that privilege. Because I walk in a room and I'm aware.
Yes, very much so.
Often. And like another thing that you were talking about on the idea of demographics and stuff, I also read a really interesting thing where, if a let's say a white guy fails shoots a terrible show or episode, I don't suddenly go, all white male directors are awful. But if a woman gets like any sort of like minority group, it tends to be like if that minority group gets a chance to be like, I've made this film, you don't like it, there tends to be more of a generalization of like, oh, female directors or black directors make weird movies.
It's like saying women can't park. Or women can't drive. Which is a common thing, right?
Yeah, it's like
true.
It's a weird generalization that happens that if I fail, somehow I represent my entire
And I think
set.
that's partly due to the fact that there's such a small pool to pull from, so it's an easy. We try and find reasons, we try and find justifications, and so there being such a small amount of people to represent a group, you have to work hard to prove yourself within that, and but I think from what I see is it's changing, and there are so many female film directors, and what's happening at Cannes this year is, all those happened in years previous, but what's happening at Cannes is in terms of female filmmakers is very interesting, and I do believe it's changing. I think as the pool is inevitably going to get bigger and more balanced, and then I think
and then that
will change, and it won't be, oh, you're representing the 3% of women filmmakers that are in this pool here. You know, you are a filmmaker.
Okay, let's talk about Con actually. So my understanding is, so Jean Campion, right? She's the president of the jury this year at Con, and for anyone who doesn't know, she just made very, very public comment, which is very, very interesting, where basically, I think there are only 3 films at Cannes this year with female directors, and she's, one of the most accomplished filmmakers in the world, and I guess she, mused very loudly, like, why is that? And then I guess somebody said 93% of the films submitted to Cannes this year were made by men. So, what's going on there? Dawn had a very interesting comment that I won't give away because I want her to speak, because she's very, very intelligent. But let's open that up. I mean, this is like the best film festival in the world. This is the president of the jury, right? And she's putting that out there. It's 2014.
What I had said is that it has a lot to do with what gets financed, and that has to do with who decides what gets financed, and the perspective that they have on stories, and also women directors getting to the point that they're able to get a movie financed that could even make it into Cannes. When I was teaching at film school, half the class was women, half the class wanted to be directors, but something happens, and who gets scripts funded and who gets attached to projects, it doesn't, you know what I mean? It's not just people not applying, you know what I mean? It's having the support in institutions, and because it also costs, like, if you think about what it takes to develop a director as someone with a vision that they can actually realize, it takes time. You need opportunities, you need the resources to make films repeatedly so that you can start to have your own stamp on the decisions you make creatively, right? And to have that, you need the support of producers and financing. And if your stories are not immediately screaming commercial to those people who have the power to finance them, you may be many years in development before your film gets made. So I just think that those are things that are happening prior to the films even getting made. There's a kind of a selection process that goes on.
What do you think about male perception of female stories? Because, before that happened in my living room, I would have said, I am the most progressive male in the world, Like, I think everyone's a bit oblivious, right? I just, I was like, I understand racism. I run an anti-racism organization. I understand that women are equals. And I was so wrong in that moment. And I was like, I didn't get it. I'm an intelligent person, and it didn't speak to me. Yeah. And my wife was crying, and I went, how can I see that so differently? Mm-hmm. And it was at that moment that I started to challenge what I thought about stuff.
Well, I was in New York last week for the Indian Film Festival, and Gurinder Chadha, who directed Bend It Like Beckham, was on a panel, and we were talking about women in film as well. And the topic of using your own stories as inspiration to create content came up. So I asked a question, and I said, well, how do we encourage men to include women and to include the female perspective and to encourage them to write about the female perspective without feeling like it's taboo or that they have no right to? And it turned into this really engaging conversation because there were several men in the session who were like, well, I write from a female perspective. I have strong female characters, and la 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 la. I was like, but that's not the point. My point is, how do we encourage more men to include a female voice? How do we encourage women to not necessarily be token feminists? It's not a feminist rant. It's about inclusivity. I think Joss Whedon says it best. I write strong female characters because they're people, or something along those lines. I don't know if that answered your question.
It's a question. I don't know the answer.
I don't know if there is an answer either.
I don't know the answer.
Well, one of the things I wanted to bring up, because I know like most of us know about the, does anyone, do people know what the Bechdel test is? Hand up if you do know what it is. Okay, because I feel like this is a really good thing to give a good perspective on what we're talking about with female perspectives. So there's three rules to the Bechdel test. The first rule is there more than 2 females with names in a movie? That's it. Okay? If there are more than 2 females with names in the movie, do those 2 females ever talk to each other?
Do they share the screen?
Yeah, do they share the screen and talk to each other? And if that is true, the last one is, do they talk about anything other than boys? About another man?
It's shocking.
It's shocking how many things fail.
There have been 9 this year, in 2014.
Yeah, I read that article.
9.
9 this year.
Star Wars
9?
fails.
9.
Like, Star Wars with the Rings, Spider-Man, like, frick. Like, insane, the amount of movies that fail.
There was a related article to that about the top 100 films of all time, and only 3 films in the top 100 film list of all time passed that test.
And it's so simple. Is there more than, most of them don't even pass the first 2. The first 2. Is there more than one female?
Who's choosing those films though? Like,
it's the standard top 100 list of the 20th century.
Like AMI or something.
Yeah, the Film Institutes of America, or Universal, whatever.
So the previous panel we were talking about power and how power sort of perpetuates and replicates itself. And that was from the issue of people of color, but you know, it's this, I see the same thing in gender, right? It's sort of like the perception of normal becomes through, for lack of a better term, the male lens, right? I think that's, let's say that's what it is. And so then, not only is it like, okay, so you, let's say even now today, let's say, okay, there's opportunity for female voices. We get that number from 93% submissions to 50% at con, and obviously we know it's not that simple, but let's say in a magical alternate universe, we do. Boom, 50-50, right? Now what's going to happen is you're going to be compared to the best films of all time, this list, right? Like people go, well, that's just like number 47. So if for, how long has the film industry been going, like 80 years or something? I mean, if they're comparing 80 years of the male lens to something they've essentially never seen, it's going to feel foreign and familiar and maybe inferior, right? So that's if that's the case, that's a major challenge, right?
But I want, sorry.
No, I was just going to say, it's even weird, like, movies that I would consider feminist fail the test. Like, Breakfast at Tiffany fails. Like, it's strong female character, but there's only one. Good name.
But I wonder if just by bringing this issue to light and including it in future conversations, if 10, 20 years down the road, we'll look back and see the evolution that's been happening. I don't know.
I think also, what has to happen really is they have to be able to go to the information they get from Netflix and find that those movies that pass that test are popular.
Yeah.
People just need to watch them. There needs to be a demand.
Yeah.
Until there's demand, it's not going to happen. There needs to be, and
That's always the bottom
how do
line.
you create demand when it's not there? But like, basically, this is what you get from executives. They just want to know what people want. There's a whole trend in using the internet to figure out what people want. And you know, my theory is always like people don't even know what they want. But you know, in theory, they want to know what you want. So there has to be ways of saying this is what we want. And it's not that women have to make movies that would pass that test. One of the scripts I've written wouldn't, but that's part of the reason I wrote it, you know. But the fact is that there has to be demand, and then women have to have the opportunity to make those movies, because a lot of us have movies like that we want to make that are based on our personal experience, because that's where you make stories from, especially when you're starting out. And then, you know, male executives and filmmakers and storytellers have to be encouraged that there's a market here for that, and it's not that hard to encourage creative people. You just have to say we have money for it.
Well, I was shocked recently when I found out that Wayne's World was directed by a woman. There was a list, again, another list, that came out of like shocking surprise films that were directed by women, and the #1 grossing film was Wayne's World.
I think it's interesting though, like you're saying, it needs demand, and like this had come up in a panel about like people of color and women, and it's hard because we're so used to seeing films that are male centric. And what am I gonna do? Just stop watching any movies that are not that?
But it's like making a conscious choice. It's
totally.
like choosing paper bags versus plastic bags. Like you have a choice, but you know one is better for the environment or worse for the environment. Not so better.
Totally.
You know what I mean? So
What percentage of the financiers are women? Because Dawn, you had brought that up, right? The issue of how many of these films are financed.
It doesn't really matter. It's like it's more a matter of how many of them are demanding a female lens.
Yeah.
That's what it is.
I guess what I would say though,
Because a woman,
yeah.
if you're an executive and you're in a position, even if you're in a position of power and you're in a position of writing checks, you do have to answer to people. So it's an extra step to say I'm gonna green light this movie that we don't have a lot of evidence that this kind of movie is going to make a lot of money. Do you know what I mean? I'm putting my job on the line if I try to finance something that really is not proven. A filmmaker that's not proven, a storyline that's not proven, a subject matter that's not proven.
I guess for me, I personally believe that we need to, I don't know, put women or in those positions of financing specifically, because if my wife wasn't there, I keep going back to that, but if my wife wasn't there, you know, and I don't know if that's my fault, maybe it is, maybe it's not, I don't know, but I would not have programmed that film.
Right.
And that would have been a big mistake for me and for the festival, and it was like, and then to be honest, I went, what else did I screw up? You know?
yeah.
That was my first year as a programmer, but I went, what else did I miss? Just because my wife wasn't watching it with me. And so, how many great scripts are just, because what I've seen is a lot of men with a lot of power in various positions, and you were talking about that too with your organization, and so then it reinforces that male lens, right? So it seems like you actually need, not just, because it's hard for me to adopt a female lens, but if you put women in positions of power where they can have that lens.
But I think men can approve that stuff, and men can learn what to look for and identify in a script. Like I think anybody that's in a position like that can either be taught to look for certain things or can be supported in a way that is possible. I don't think you have to be a woman to be able to do that. And I think there's lots of women who would miss some of the stuff that you missed. There are, you know, or there's always this element in this field of subjectivity and people's taste, right? Like that's always going to be a factor. Like, and it's not fair to say that they shouldn't be able to have their own taste when it comes to creatively what they like and what they want to support. But if you have somebody who's running a company and they say, you know, this is our agenda, this is the kind of voice we want, these are examples of those kinds of films, here is a list of filmmakers, here's a list of writers, here's a list of books that have that kind of perspective,